What is her remorse? What is she sorry about?
That she didn't make different decisions, and that would have resulted in the children being more protected.
Is she delusional?
I'm not going to respond to that.
Jodi Hildebrandt, the one-time Utah mental health counselor sent to prison for abusing the children of her business partner Ruby Franke, has been called evil by people close to the Franke family, but others say they've been trying to call out Jodi's ruthless behavior for years, and it took an emaciated child covered in bruises and restraints going to a neighbor's home to beg for help before many of these crimes now came into the light. But now, a new lawsuit from a former client of Jodi's company, ConneXions Classroom, details other alleged criminal activity. And we are going to break it all down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is a Law&Crime legal alert. Did you know that children are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the research is potentially linking ultra-processed foods to this? Yeah, well, Morgan & Morgan is stepping in to fight to hold these food companies accountable. With decades of experience fighting large corporations, they're ready to stand up for what families deserve: justice. If your child under 21 has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or fatty liver disease, then visit www.forthepeople.com/food to learn more. This is a follow-up story to one that we covered yesterday, where a Utah dad named Michael Tilleman filed a huge 150-page lawsuit against Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, who are both in prison after pleading guilty to aggravated child abuse of Ruby's children, ConneXions Classroom, LLC, and his ex-wife, McCall Savage. And he is seeking at least $5 million in damages, claiming the defendants were and still are running a racketeering enterprise through ConneXions. Basically, a criminal enterprise, okay? If you've been following our coverage of the YSL case or the Diddy case, this is what we're talking about, these alleged criminal enterprises. Now, Tilleman insists he didn't know about the, quote, illegitimate, fraudulent, and harmful nature of the enterprise until Jodi and Ruby were arrested in 2023. In other words, that is why he's suing now. But he claims in the years prior to their arrests, his then wife became heavily involved in ConneXions, and she had poured marital money into it despite Tilleman's objections. But he says things got really bad when Jodi started trying to interfere in their marriage, and allegedly encouraged his wife to abuse their daughter as a way to bring her into the light. Remember, that's a big theme in the Franke Hildebrandt story, that children needed to be abused. It was for their own good, and the children had to come to understand that this was for their own good. Pretty sickening stuff. But as a reminder, neither Jodi, Ruby, nor Tilleman's ex-wife have ever been criminally charged in connection with anything that Tilleman has been talking about in this lawsuit. These are just allegations. Just want to make that clear. Now, again, we did a whole Sidebar episode yesterday that kind of gave the overarching big picture look at this lawsuit, but this is a quick overview before we get a little bit more granular and a little bit more specific. So the lawsuit reads, under the guise of providing help to those in need, ConneXions fraudulent services are intended to bring individuals under the enterprise's financial and psychological control, entice victims to spend money on fraudulently advertised services which perpetuate and promote child abuse and other illegal acts, encourage psychological abuse, and ultimately break families, all while financially enriching the defendants and further perpetuating the enterprise. So Tilleman claims that Jodi and others at ConneXions lured people in with the promise of an improved well-being and an improved family life, but instead what they really were doing were tearing families apart, all while Jodi was amassing a small fortune. So Tilleman's attorneys write, quote, "The enterprise continues to function even while Hildebrandt and Franke are incarcerated. Plaintiff brings this suit for declaratory and injunctive relief to enjoin, meaning to stop, the enterprise from causing harm, as well as for monetary damages caused by defendants through the enterprise." Now, we're going to drill down to some of the specific points here and the specific allegations of misconduct by Jodi and those close to her. Again, these are just allegations, but let's go through it. Real quick, what do we know about Jodi Hildebrandt? Well, we've been able to confirm through the Utah Division of Professional Licensing that Jodi obtained her master's in education psychology from the University of Utah in 2003. She was first licensed as a clinical mental health counselor in Utah in July of 2005. but her license, based on our research, was officially revoked after Jodi was sentenced to spend 4 to 30 years in prison. It'll be up to the parole board to decide when she and Ruby will actually be released. A little caveat, little nuance there in Utah law. But in the years before her arrest, Tilleman claims that Jodi was using her beliefs to essentially destroy lives. And to kind of give you an idea of what he's alleging, Jodi often spoke in these videos and public commentary about the concept of distortion. This was in her podcasts, her ConneXions podcast and social media videos.
So when I think about the word hijacked, I think about distortion. I think about the characteristics of distortion. So control is a characteristic of distortion. Engaging in any form of deception, so manipulation, secrecy, hiding, entitlement, aggression, threatening, bullying, blaming, all of those presentations are all distorted because they all have the underpinning of deception.
All right, so now going back to Tilleman's lawsuit, it reads in part, quote, Hildebrandt categorized her personal services through ConneXions as life coaching to evade the legal, ethical, and professional responsibilities imposed on therapists. So Tilleman asserts that people should have known there was something wrong here, there was something amiss, based on the forms that Hildebrandt allegedly had patients and clients sign before getting services from ConneXions. He alleges Hildebrandt claimed to not even be using her therapy license and was instead offering life coaching. Tilleman claims the form stated, "This is not psychotherapy. This is not therapy, and no therapist-patient relationship is created." In other words, he's saying this was a way to get her out of her responsibilities and her obligations, and again, the legal and ethical responsibilities and obligations that come with that. According to the lawsuit, according to Tilleman, ConneXions was a money-making scheme. The lawsuit states, to manipulate victims into purchasing services and products from ConneXions, Hildebrandt diagnosed victims with pornography and/or sex addictions when the victims did not exhibit signs or symptoms of either. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt also instructed so-called mental fitness trainers affiliated with and/or employed by ConneXions to induce victims into purchasing services and products from ConneXions by falsely diagnosing victims with non-existent mental health disorders. And by the way, when you're talking about a money-making scheme, this filing lays out some of the prices of ConneXions services. Get this, nearly $800 for the individual leadership training program, which Tilleman said included individual sessions with a trainer, not necessarily Jodi, but a workbook, access to podcasts, more. Almost $5,000 for the team leadership training program, $15,000 for the company leadership training program, and then there were the individual sessions. So according to Tilleman, it was $181. I mean, such a specific number, by the way, $181 for every 50-minute session with Jodi, a parenting class for $218, and $84 a month for membership to the ConneXions Insiders group that allows users apparently to pose video questions to Jodi or Ruby directly. Doesn't that sound great? Now, while we don't know exactly how much money Jodi was making through ConneXions, what we do know is that the compound that she owned in Ivins, Utah, where these two kids of Ruby Franke were ultimately recovered, where they were rescued, it was at one point listed for $5 million. Now, Tilleman asserts that as part of this alleged racketeering enterprise, this criminal enterprise, Jodi and her associates allegedly committed thousands of instances of wire fraud. And when Tilleman's attorneys refer to wire fraud, they're not only talking about moving money across state lines as part of a fraud, but they're talking about the perpetuation of that fraud using things like social media pages, podcasts, mailed DVD sets, all fraud through wire transfers. The complaint even says from May 22nd, 2023 through August 30th, 2023, the time in which Hildebrandt and Franke admitted to this secret torture and abuse of children at Hildebrandt's mansion, they broadcast at least 75 interstate wire communications in the form of podcasts and social media posts from Hildebrandt's compound. And Tilleman accuses Hildebrandt of hundreds of acts of federal wire fraud dating as far back as 2008. He believes Ruby committed just short of 300 acts of federal wire fraud during her time with Jodi. But again, neither of them have been criminally charged with respect to wire fraud. But again, this is what's being alleged. And in fact, I should also tell you, Exhibit A of this lawsuit lays out pages and pages and pages of specific alleged wire fraud with dates and links to particular online posts by ConneXions. And Tilleman also names other alleged co-conspirators who aren't named as defendants in the lawsuit, but that he believes were directly involved in helping this alleged criminal enterprise. One of those people named in the suit is Ted Guerin, who Tilleman claims is a social worker. And remember, Tilleman's wife, referred to in the complaint by a prior last name, Savage, allegedly had been taken in by what Tilleman referred to as a cult. And he claims she did whatever Jodi told her to do, no matter what. And that includes allegedly instructing Savage on how to use her marriage and their daughter, referred to by her initials EJT, as weapons. The complaint reads, Savage confirmed under oath that she threatened plaintiff with divorce if he did not attend counseling with Guerin. At Savage's assistance on September 22, 2016, plaintiff met with Guerin. Shortly thereafter, on or around September 28, 2016, Savage threatened plaintiff that if plaintiff did not consent to the disclosure of his records from his meeting with Guerin to Savage, she would not permit plaintiff to see EJT. Upon information and belief, and by the way, that just means you don't have the information right now. As this lawsuit progresses, I will get that information. I'll get the evidence to prove it. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt instructed Savage to utilize this manipulation tactic to keep plaintiff attached to the enterprise through Savage and EJT. Plaintiff did not consent to the disclosure of his records from his meeting with Guerin. Notwithstanding the lack of consent, Guerin knowingly violated plaintiff's HIPAA rights after this meeting, calling Savage and reporting false information to her despite plaintiff informing Guerin repeatedly that he was not authorized to discuss plaintiff's confidential information with anyone. Guerin provided all of plaintiff's records to Savage despite plaintiff telling him he was not authorized to do so. Guerin also falsified plaintiff's records to make it appear that plaintiff had given consent to this disclosure. Savage later released these confidential records in her divorce proceedings with plaintiff, even after plaintiff informed Savage multiple times that she had obtained the records unlawfully. By the way, one more thing I have to mention. These are serious allegations. It does become a question how he's going to be able to prove that, how he's going to be able to prove he had these conversations with Guerin and how he told him not to release this and how these things were falsified. That still has to be proved. So allegations are one thing, proving it in a court of law is another thing. By the way, according to Tilleman, Guerin, Savage, and Jodi, they all violated his privacy and broke laws by disclosing information that he explicitly said they could not have or share, and particularly troubling since Jodi was acting as a counselor and had access to some of her clients' most intimate thoughts and feelings. So this is a really, really serious allegation. And the lawsuit also makes the claim that Jodi was trying to launder the money that she was making from ConneXions through improper transfers. And that would speak to the idea that Jodi allegedly knew she was making money off of something fraudulent and illegal and didn't want to get caught. That's why people allegedly launder money. The lawsuit reads, although not predicate acts under plaintiff's RICO claims pled below, but meaning you don't really need to prove these things. They're not underlying acts that you need to prove this criminal enterprise. It's kind of a secondary, ancillary, alleged criminal activity. They say this pattern of behavior, which may constitute criminal laundering of monetary instruments and interstate travel to aid in racketeering enterprises, demonstrates the relatedness and continuity of the enterprise. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt and Bottcher transferred Hildebrandt's funds into one or more of Bottcher's bank accounts. By the way, that's Pam Bottcher. We've talked about her before in the past in Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt Sidebar episodes, but we're going to be taking a closer look at her alleged involvement in ConneXions as well, and also her alleged knowledge of any ongoing abuse. We're going to do that in a future episode, but she had been involved with the company since basically its inception. She spent a lot of time with both Jodi and Ruby, and Tilleman claims that she was helping Jodi hide assets, another big allegation. So the filing continues. On January 17, 2024, Utah's 5th Judicial District Court entered a temporary restraining order to enjoin, again to stop, Hildebrandt from liquidating, concealing, or transferring her personal assets prior to the establishment of criminal restitution for victims 1 and 2. In its order, the court identified that Bottcher may be one of the third parties and/or entities through which Hildebrandt is concealing personal property and money. The order also identified one or more ConneXions entities affiliated with Hildebrandt as one or more of the third parties and/or entities through which Hildebrandt is concealing personal property and money. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt received these funds as a result of her racketeering behavior, including without limitation through her pattern of engaging in wire fraud along with members of the enterprise, including without limitation Franke, Savage, and Botcher. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt and Botcher conducted these financial transactions for the purpose of operating the enterprise's racketeering scheme by allowing Hildebrandt to have sufficient funds after or during her incarceration to continue carrying on the unlawful affairs of the enterprise. Wow. And it continues, Hildebrandt engaged in a monetary transaction in property derived from specified unlawful activity, specifically through her purchase of the Ivins residence. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt, on multiple occasions, traveled from Utah to Arizona and attempted to purchase real property using racketeering proceeds. Specifically, upon information and belief, Hildebrandt traveled from Utah to Arizona on at least 2 occasions on or around July 15, 2023, and on or around August 1, 2023. Upon information and belief, Hildebrandt traveled to Arizona in the search for a new residence in which to torture at least victims 1 and 2, if not other minor victims, in furtherance of the enterprise's objective of child abuse and child torture, and/or create content for the enterprise's various fraudulent services, including without limitation training videos, classes, and written content, all of which the enterprise charged members located across the United States and/or internationally to purchase. That is quite the alleged scheme that is being laid out here. And by the way, you may remember that in the journal that Ruby kept documenting the abuse of her children, she mentioned that Jodi had been looking for another place where they could isolate the children even further. And you heard those dates, July 15, 2023, August 1st, 2023. That is just weeks before this pair was arrested. So it's chilling to think about what might have happened to the 2 youngest Franke children if they had been moved to an unknown different location. That's a pretty frightening thing to be thinking about. So as I mentioned, both Ruby and Jodi, they are currently locked up in the Utah State Correctional Facility in the Women's General Population Unit, according to the State Corrections website. In the next few years, the women may come up for parole, but experts we spoke to say it is very unlikely that they will be released then or in the near future, considering what they pled guilty to and what they did. They could spend up to 30 years behind bars. But to give you a sense of where things stand, here is what both Ruby and Jodi had to say to the court after they pled guilty.
For the past 4 years, I've chosen to follow counsel and guidance that has led me into a dark delusion. My distorted version of reality went largely unchecked as I would isolate from anyone who challenged me. I was led to believe that this world was an evil place, filled with cops who control, hospitals that injure, government agencies that brainwash, church leaders who lie and lust, husbands who refuse to protect, and children who need abused. My choice to believe and behave this paranoia culminated into criminal activity for which I stand before you today ready to take accountability. Jodi Hildebrandt was never my business partner, nor was I ever employed by her. I have never received wages from her or ConneXions. Jodi was employed as my son's counselor in 2019, and in 2020 I paid her to be my mentor. It is important to me to demonstrate my remorse and regret without blame. I take full accountability for my choices, and it is my preference that I serve a prison sentence.
I sincerely love these children. I desire for them to heal physically and emotionally. One of the reasons I did not go to trial is that I did not want them to emotionally relive the experience which would have been detrimental to them. My hope and prayer is that they will heal and move forward to have beautiful lives. I am willing to submit to what the state feels would be an appropriate amount of time served to make retribution as an outcome.
Quite the statements there. Now, Tilleman asserts that Jodi is still running ConneXions from behind bars, using staunch supporters like his ex-wife to do her bidding. And time will tell if this lawsuit morphs into something more, as Tilleman contends that dozens of families have been torn apart by the actions of those involved in ConneXions. But that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.